we're the ones, who not only grew up on these platforms, but who were most changed by it, arguably. The opportunities available to us and the sort of norms that we're expected to follow as students, as professionals, and as now adults conducting ourselves in the world are very different in a way that doesn't get talked about quite as much.
Welcome back to Tech Pathways, our ZETA podcast. My name is Jose Gaona. I'm the president and CEO of ZETA. Really excited to be joined today in today's episode by Nick Plante, researcher, organizer, and storyteller whose journey both professionally and personally brings fresh insight into how we build a healthier, more intentional relationship with the technology that we use in our everyday lives. How often we should and shouldn't use these tools shaping our digital world. In this episode, we'll explore how personal loss helped shape Nick's early relationship with tech and how those experiences sparked a career at the intersection of psychology, advocacy, and systems change. From founding a startup aimed at real-world connection to organizing coalitions for tech accountability. Nick is helping lead a new conversation around digital well-being and knowing when to unplug. Let's get into it. Hey, Nick, how are you doing?
About
Oh my
you.
gosh, I know, right? It's 99 degrees in DC. I think it's like a feel like temperature of like 105. And I got some blood drawn, so
Oh, wow.
we're hanging in there.
Got blood drawn. I voted this morning.
Oh,
At
there we go. It
least we're
was a
staying
good day.
engaged despite the weather.
That's called resiliency, right? Yeah. No, it's a good day. And there's so much to talk about. Um, that we there's so much busyness in the world, and I think sometimes it's just so nice to take a step back and talk about how we are being intentional about our health and wellness, particularly on days like today. I think folks kind of have that top of mind, right? Drink enough water, get enough rest, find a cool spot to kind of like lay in with this heat wave that we have across the east right now. But I'm genuinely really excited to have you for this conversation, Nick, and thank you so much for making the time. This is such a fascinating topic for our generation, right?
For sure. I'm
Yeah,
grateful to be here because I think the work we've both been doing are, deeply intertwined, and I'm excited to, dig into that more here because
yeah,
we haven't really had a chance to yet. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That's totally right. Well, let's get into it, right? So the first part of the conversation that I want to explore, Nick, that I think is important to kind of set some foundation, right, around the work that you've done and some of these intersections. I want to talk about the impacts that I think we're all familiar with to some extent of this addiction to scrolling that we all, I think, kind of have, right, whether we admit to it or not. You've talked about how, like many Gen Z, you grew up with your phone as almost a constant presence. When did you first realize that your relationship with technology, particularly social media, had become maybe a little bit too much, a little too mindless, and not as much mindful?
yeah. So I'm 24 right now. I'm turning 25 in a couple weeks, which means I am part of that sweet spot of Gen Z that got every new device right at the milestones of psychological development. I started puberty probably like 2011, 2012, which is right when I got an iPhone, right when I went off to middle school, and all of my friends also had iPhones. I was really excited by it at the time. I think I might have been the first person in my class to use Instagram. At the very least, I was recruiting everyone I could on there. I was like, this is so dope. You guys have to check it out, right? Come look at me reposting a bunch of memes that I'm finding online. I'm so funny, right? But then as I got a little bit older, I think around when I started high school, there was definitely some sort of fatigue that set in. I didn't know how to name it at the time. I don't think any of us really did. But I kind of took stock of how much I was doing online, right? It was not just being on my iPhone, not just being on social media, but it was video chatting people on my laptop all the time, right? There was Uvu and then Skype. I don't know if you remember those. And I was a pretty big gamer as well for, the first, I don't know, 10, 12, 14 years of my life. And it kind of got to a point where I was like, wow, I don't have a ton of time to study for school. I don't have a ton of time to learn guitar like I wanted to. Um, if I actually am going to go to baseball practice like my dad wants, I have to like make a sacrifice here. So I started to try out a few like really basic things as early as maybe ninth or 10th grade, where I would get home and I'd actually give my phone to my mom and be like, hey, I know that this is kind of gonna like distract me while I'm trying to do homework. So could you just like leave it in another room and like don't let me have it until I'm done with work?
That's
So
some willpower.
yeah, I
Like you were
had
you were
that,
making that decision.
yeah, I had that self-control somehow, but I didn't like realize, what was going on behind the scenes with big tech or anything like that. It was purely just an instinct of like, I still think this stuff is really fun. I still want to be a part of it all, but I recognize on some level that it's not entirely compatible with spending my time as like a diligent high school student would.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I can't imagine that that many young folks were thinking that proactively to say I should make the decision to disconnect and put this device away. Particularly for the folks that are on the younger side of Gen Z, right? You talk about being 24, turning 25. Um, I think I'm a little bit older than you. I'm 27, about to turn 28 next month. Um,
Birthday
so
neighbors. What
yeah.
day?
Oh, really? Yeah. Are you
Ooh,
July baby?
yeah, July 19.
Oh, 31st. There
Nice.
we go. It's the best month to be born in,
Oh yeah.
except for the heat. Uh, but it's interesting because I remember MySpace, right? Like I remember opening up a MySpace and having no idea what it was for, but I just thought it was like the cool thing when I was little. And I don't even think anyone that I knew my age was on it. I'm pretty sure it was like my older siblings. But I just like knew through them that it was like the thing to do. But like I remember opening up a Facebook when Facebook was still like very early in like the kind of like up and coming space, and then just really never stopping from there, right? Like just kind of being a part of that wave. I'm on like the kind of the older side of the generation, but for most of the folks in our Gen Z generation, like this stuff has just always been, right? Like this digital connectivity and beyond that, like a digital pressure has always just been, which I mean, I think we talk about often, and you all certainly talk about like what are the implications of that and how do you navigate that. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves because I have another question here for you on that topic, which is that you've shared that your father's passing during your first year of college was a core turning point. How did that experience specifically push you to reevaluate tech habits, and what did that process making changes that process of making changes look like for you after that life event?
Yeah, thanks for making space to talk about that. Because like you pointed out, it was just the norm to sign up for every new app that came up, right? To kind of get on any wave, any trend that was occurring around, in school, on teams I was a part of. It was just the way to do it. You were almost kind of weird if you abstained from any of it. So I didn't think twice, right? For most of my upbringing, it was just like considered normal, even by my parents, that I was on Facebook, that I was, on my phone all the time. That I was like chatting with my friends after school. There would be a few moments where, maybe they'd come in and be like, oh, wow, you're still on the computer, right? Or like, some vague questions like, so what do you guys actually do on there? Which is
Yeah.
really hard to answer. Like, I don't know. We're just like looking at funny videos and talking and
Yeah.
sending each other emojis. I don't know. It felt right at the time, but um, was so new that we didn't necessarily have language for it. But by the time I got to college, I guess there was, like enough in the air, and we had spent enough time in those environments where um, things were starting to become a little bit clearer.
When was your first year of college, if you don't
Yeah,
mind me asking
so
what
it
year?
was 2018 to 2019.
Okay.
So, yeah, I got to college. I went to school in Philly, which is about like 2 hours where I grew up, 2 hours from where I grew up in New York. And I didn't know anyone else who was going to that school. I was the only one from my high school class that chose this place. And um, it was a very different environment than what I was used to as well. I went to an all boys Catholic high school, which, by the way, might play into like that discipline that I kind of brought to the table. um, but I think, going to a school like Penn, which was, full of diverse people with like new ideas and how they viewed the world, different lifestyles that I'd never really considered for myself. Um, I wasn't so sure that like the way I had been going about it and like the kind of, yeah, like Catholic guilt version of self-control was necessarily appropriate. So I let myself loosen up a little bit actually. And I like carried my phone with me more regularly. I'd sort of like do the thing where you're like multitasking, you're doing your homework, doing your reading, but also kind of checking your phone here and there as you go and you need those little psychological breaks. And it became very normal for me to just like buy back into the whole digital ecosystem. But as you alluded to, at the end of my first semester, my dad had passed away somewhat suddenly. We knew he'd been dealing with an illness for a little while, but we didn't understand what the scope of that was. And when I got back that following semester, bracket, I had considered taking some time off, but my family really encouraged me, like, just keep going. That's what, dad would want. That's what we think is best for you. And I had no better ideas of how I'd spend that time. So I was like, all right, I'll go for it and see what happens. So when I got back to campus, it was still a pretty unfamiliar environment. And I kind of realized that I was looking to all of my pre-existing relationships from home, and I was looking to my default habits, right, of like watching certain YouTubers, going on certain Instagram rabbit holes, right? I was falling back on all of that as my kind of comfort tactics in that time of need. I wasn't really pushing outside of that to make new friends on campus and to find kind of like an embodied community to exist within and go through that healing that I needed to go through. And in so many words, um, I kind of found myself starting to rebel a little bit against the way that I'd been spending my time. And again, in so many words, I started to realize that maybe I'd been given a false promise about like what all of these things were and what they were supposed to do. A lot of us come to these platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, dating apps, and shortly after that period, TikTok blew up. We come to all of those under the impression that they are going to connect us with new people. They're going to make us closer to the people we already know. They're going to help us express ourselves, be more creative in all these amazing ways. And they've done that sometimes, maybe here and there, but they certainly were not doing that for me in that period. When again, what I really needed was to move outside of myself and be with new people and really just be present with them. But I was, kind of staying up late, texting a couple friends who lived 2 hours away, or maybe at this point they were across the country at another school. And it just wasn't enough for me in that period. It wasn't giving me that connectedness that I thought it would. And I kind of set out to do something about it.
I want to say one, thank you for sharing and being open about some of this experience. I think what you're sharing, Nick, is really profound for multiple reasons. Um, in part, I think it's interesting to hear someone again this young talk um, so profoundly about connectivity and maybe some false promises and um, hopes that younger folks have for finding a sense of community or connection on digital landscapes in the digital world that really are not and never will be a replacement for genuine human connection. Uh, it's interesting to me to kind of hear this story in detail because what stands out to me is when we go through these really major life moments, I think we really do, as a part of our human experience, crave genuine community and connection. And in those times when we have that like heightened sense of need for community, we will realize, or we do realize that digital connectivity is not the same. And I say that as a part of an organization that puts a value on the digital world and what it does for people and the exchange of ideas and opportunities that come about as a result of the digital world. But I also think that that's a balance that Gen Z carries really well. And I've been really inspired to kind of see that amongst the younger folks in our generation, that they're very conscious of the fact that like the digital world is not their existence. And I actually find that folks on the younger side of our generation disconnect more intentionally. Curious to kind of dive into that a little bit more with you. But I think a lot of folks don't. I actually think a lot of folks that were maybe a part of adopting some of these platforms as adults or pioneering them struggle with that distinguishing that difference in connection. I would say that over the last year, as I've shifted and as ZETA has grown and we've kind of built this organization, and my schedule has become increasingly more dense and occupied with more and more and more, I am craving true in-person unplugged connection that much more because it's just become so much more scarce. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Um, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the next step to the the thoughts that you were having because you didn't just stop at like kind of
Yeah.
self-assessing and figuring out like how is this technology serving you, and what's the dynamic you want to craft. You took it a step further and then started pursuing this as an area of academia, right? Like you
Yeah.
started doing research, you started kind of exploring the why. um, and so I'm curious to know, even though a lot of people try to reduce their screen time, you started doing that research. What made you want to specifically study that behavior change? Uh, and what were you hoping to uncover when you started that?
Yeah, so a common thread here so far has been the absence of like adequate language to describe what we're going through at those ages. And I think you put it really well just now in the contrast between what, maybe someone our parents' age thinks and feels and does when it comes to technology and what we went through growing up. Because there's a much more limited vocabulary for younger people to kind of go to their parents or their teachers or whoever's in their lives and say like, hey, I think that I am missing out on blank. What is it exactly that we're craving? We know it's some form of connection, we know it's some form of community, but um there's like not enough there to know exactly what the next step is. And I was really interested in putting words to what that next step could be. And I started to do just like a little bit of personal research at first, which brought me down, ironically, I think like some Reddit rabbit holes and like some weird places of the internet that were starting to crop up at that time. I mentioned Reddit because I know there's like a thread or two on there about like dumb phones and minimalism, right? Digital minimalism, and like No Surf is another group. Yeah. And I saw that a lot of those people, again, this is like 2019. So they were talking about it in terms of screen time. That was kind of like one of the first ways for us to go from this general sense of malaise and discontent to like actually forming concrete steps that we could take alone, but also together in solidarity as a way to like manage this stuff more. And um, I think with that, also came Apple's set of features. I don't know if it was that year, but it was like vaguely in that era, where they'd give you your weekly screen time report and let you sort of like lock yourself out of apps if you were using them for too long, which I was enticed by at first. But then I found I just kept overriding the rules setting. It was just like too easy for some reason to bypass that. And then I started, the deeper I got into my psychology degree, I started to realize like, oh, maybe there's something here. Like maybe people are writing research papers about these things. Maybe the adults have better language than we do on our own. And I found that there was some who were like directly confronting the tech use problems head on, but it was few and far between. What was more useful to me in that moment were just like broad psychological principles and concepts that I was learning in my different seminars. And one of them was this idea of an intention behavior gap. I remember that really resonated with me because my intentions were pretty clear. They were getting there at that point. Like I want to spend less time, doing things that just aren't fulfilling me. I want to spend less time in this like mindset that is maybe making my pain and grief worse instead of bringing me to some kind of restoration. And my behaviors, my habits just were not in line with that yet, right? I thought one way, but I was still functionally spending most of my time looking into the little black box, right? And I could like go around and preach as much as I wanted to my friends, but they weren't gonna just like suddenly change all of their habits either. So what was I to do? I had a really good professor one semester who gave us a final project that was like propose your own original research. And I'd never done something like that before. And I wasn't positive that I wanted to work in a lab setting. But after I went through this exercise, I realized like, wow, this could really be a way to do something a little more impactful about the way I'm feeling. I'm not gonna solve phone addiction or whatever you want to call it overnight, but I did see it as a way to workshop some of these ideas and look at some of these concerns from new angles. So what I ended up doing was, I formulated a series of what they call like behavior change interventions, different ways for us to test, um, yeah, like whether we could reduce some of these unwanted behaviors more effectively. And again, it was all kind of reliant on that intention behavior gap idea. So we did things that, um, basically like addressed people's motivations and their internal feelings about tech use. And then we also manipulated their external environment. And we wanted to see if there was like a difference between those two things, which flows from this idea in psychology. Um, you might hear it called a few different things, but like the fundamental attribution error in social psych, for example, which is this idea that people are like overconfident or they place too much weight in what they can do from their own like internal power, their own self-control, and they underestimate the importance of like external help, external guardrails. So with all of this kind of swelling in my brain, I came up with different approaches to try to see if we could convince people to stop, putting so much of the onus on themselves to say, oh, I just have to find it within me to like put my phone down, to delete Instagram, to do whatever, right? And give them more kind of outside help to get them through that.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So it brings up a follow-up question, because I think you've answered the second question I had here. Uh, uh, if you'll indulge me, I'm so
Sure.
curious to know, um, what was the pandemic like for you?
Mm,
As we were all kind of forced to kind of retreat into our homes and then find connection virtually.
yeah.
How did you experience that, given this experience you were going through in kind of understanding the negative habits of being forced to only connect with folks digitally?
I think the pandemic was, while a bit difficult at the time, what I needed to really step my game up with this all because I was in the formulation stage during COVID. I was at home for most of that year, taking classes on Zoom, right? And actually like writing up the strategy for all this research with the idea that I'd go back next year and run it in person. So there's definitely a frustration there of like, oh man, I'm the guy who's trying to spend less time in like certain screen modes, but I'm on my computer all day. Um, However, I think it gave me like so much more insight because I was able to like sit and reflect and really come to a better understanding like how do I feel um when I'm engaging with different hardware and different software. When does it feel good and productive? Because it obviously is sometimes. And when does it start to veer into that space of like not being as helpful as you might think? So I was very generative on that front. And I also took it as a chance to step up like the personal experimentation once more. Um, my family had a storage unit at that point in time, so I drove my iPhone over to it, put it away for a month at one point, and limited myself to like computer for class, right? And the idea being like when I was done with schoolwork, I'd try to rest my brain a bit, read a physical book, go for a walk with my mom, right? Just like do things that weren't in the digital ecosystem as much. Um, didn't always work that well in practice. I feel like we all ended up spending the whole day on our computer and like falling asleep with our computer in our arms sometimes. But I'm glad that I tried that stuff out when I had the opportunity.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I can imagine, right? Like you're doing this research and you're finding yourself ironically in front of a screen. Um, and that's something that we've become really hyper aware of at Zeta, in part because we're a nationwide team. And so the majority of our work very often is just on a screen, right? With the exception of a lot of our policy work here in DC, which is in person. It can get a little taxing, and building an organization from scratch in that medium requires a lot of creativity around how to build community, how to build genuine connection. Even though we're very new, we prioritize flying folks out to have face-to-face time and building that sense of community. Certainly helps that we all kind of were around the same network before starting the org. But these are things that we're going to continue to face, right? I mean, the pandemic has kind of slowly faded into secondary thought, but this culture shift, particularly around like these virtual communities or virtual workspaces, are have not gone away, right? Which is interesting to think about. I want to talk about your movement out of college, your kind of entering into the entrepreneurial space, and this kind of next wave of your work. So after graduation, you transitioned into the startup space. building a platform focused on in-person connection. What was it like trying to turn your research and the values that you had collected into a real world product?
Yeah. So one of the takeaways for my undergrad research was kind of distilled into the idea of friction. I think that's picked up in the discourse in like responsible tech and kind of digital wellness since then, but it was relatively new, 4 or 5 years ago. Um, and, by friction, I mean building some useful inefficiency into the design of your technology, right? So instead of making it so convenient, so easy, and so smooth to just pick something up and fall into that rabbit hole, fall into that endless scrolling, um, what are things that we can do to make it physically harder, to dip into a bad habit, and things that slow you down so that you can think a little more deliberately and make a more active decision before you're interacting with the product. And that was really at the core of what I was interested in exploring when I was done with school. I had a few peers who I had been working with, both in that research and just kind of like in thinking about these things. Um, we came together and yeah, we basically had this idea to come up with our own social media alternative that was marked with a lot more of these desirable friction points. And we also understood by then that the incentive structure of the incumbent social media companies is to keep you online as much as possible, right? They are designed for your eyeballs to stay on the feed so that you can keep passing ads. The more ads you pass, the more companies pay for more ad placements. And Meta and TikTok and Snap all get richer off of this. And, we were really interested in what an ad-free model for some kind of social tool, some kind of forum could look like for young people, especially. And we played around with a few different versions of what that idea could look like when we were still students. So we actually tested some MVPs in parallel to like my thesis project that I had been working on. And we settled on this idea that was a little more niche than we thought it would be. Instead of being like a social media alternative to serve everyone, it was for a particular community, i.e., those who are interested in creative projects, right? So, like lens-based artists, photographers and videographers, dancers, musicians. We came from that world. I had a lot of like filmmaking and writing experience growing up and in the earlier part of college. And we noticed, especially after COVID, to your point, that there was this like deep desire to shake things up, to get back into the real world with people and create things, and to also just like get another way of building your network that wasn't, cold DMs. So, for context there, like when I was trying to find gigs to film, when I was like 17, 18, 19, I would just DM people, whether like organizations or individuals who seemed like they had a lot of like interesting content. I'd be like, hey, would love to work together sometime. There's like a very like awkward and unnatural way of going about it. And the response rate, was always on the lower end. And we didn't think that it had to be that way. So we took all of these ideas that were swirling around and we built this thing called Carousel, which was basically, yeah, a place for people to um, find one another based on their interests, based on the kind of work that they wanted to be doing, and based on where they were located. We also opened a physical studio space in Brooklyn and offered that up for programming and also just like as a place for people to kind of come and hang out and get to know each other. And it was more, I guess, of like a subscription model in that way. That was how we were able to move away from ads. And we just wanted to give this in-person community opportunity for people. And another thing we offered was just like the full service sort of facilitation of these projects for people. So they would meet each other through our platform, and then we would kind of help them find a location, create a mood board, set up the content delivery and distribution with one another. And we built a lot of great partnerships with that project, worked with a lot of universities in the Northeast and groups around New York. But I decided that I wanted to move on after a while because it was becoming clear to me that the kind of marketplace that we were situated in was a lot more complex than I had understood at that young age, and that the fight was going to be best served by continuing to learn more and more and to see these things from different angles. I didn't want to just stay in one place at that point. So I personally moved on from the project and yeah, took more steps that I'm sure we'll get into in the next question.
Yes, we will. So this is really interesting. Particularly, I think it's interesting that you gravitated towards working with folks that were in this creator community. The way you facilitated is interesting because it reminds me of models that I think we used to see in the 80s and 90s, maybe a little bit more, where folks kind of had these collectives where they'd kind of organize and come together. And it's interesting to think about how some of those things are lost to
Mm.
technology, right? As we kind of assume that technology facilitates better, more efficient ways to replace some of these things, sometimes there's like a knowledge loss, right? That's worth bringing back, which I think is really interesting. I do want to keep going with these questions. I want to talk about your work with Design It For Us. So you serve as organizing director for Design It For Us, a Gen Z-led coalition advocating for responsible tech. We love that. Why is this kind of work youth-led, systemic, values-based? I feel like I'm. This is very funny to ask this question as an organization like Zeta, but it's awesome to have a peer organization in this
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So please do tell, why is this kind of work, youth-led, systemic values-based, so urgent right now?
For sure. So, I mean, we're the ones, who not only grew up on these platforms, but who were most changed by it, arguably. And I don't just mean that in the ways that we've been alluding to so far, like the psychological kind of rewiring of the brain, right? And all the different habits that we grew up with that no one else could ever have imagined, in years before. But the opportunities available to us and the sort of norms that we're expected to follow as students, as professionals, and as now adults conducting ourselves in the world are very different in a way that doesn't get talked about quite as much as the other things. So, by that, you know, um, I mean the incentives for a young person like me who's trying to like build a new app, right, are actually distorted in ways that most people don't pick up on. There's always this idea in the back of your head that you might um, be trying to sell to one of the big tech companies in the end, or whatever decisions you're making are kind of done like relative to what those companies do and relative to how they've conditioned people to be. And it makes you actually a lot less free to pursue the values that you're trying to and to like shape the tools in the way that you really think that they should be shaped. Um, so at Design It For Us, I specifically lead an antitrust working group, and there we are interested in how Gen Z can play a bigger role in this fight against the unchecked corporate power of companies like Meta and Apple and Google and so on, right? We've recognized that all these sort of statistics that seem, disparate and disconnected from one each other, from each other, like the idea that a lot of Gen Z young professionals are feeling lost and confused and they're quiet quitting. They haven't really found, meaningful work. The housing crisis, right, which has many other factors as well, but um, is also in part being influenced by the idea that we are not well anchored right now as a generation. We're still kind of in this mode of like figuring it out. Um, and then there are other things, that concern um, our general value structure. Like, are we prioritizing long-term relationships, romance with one another? Are we prioritizing, um, trying to get good at something first before we settle down? All of these things kind of feel in flux, and we see tons of reports, both academic and not so much, in the news very regularly at this point. And at Design It For Us, we're interested again in the roles that um, big tech companies play in that, and that our upbringing as digital natives plays in that. We're looking at the relationship between platform design on one hand, the economic landscape, right, the makeup of the marketplace, and also the opportunities that are out there to incentivize different behavior among corporate leaders. So that looks like, safety by design type of legislation where companies are required to engineer their platforms differently, where they have to, with our input, with our lived experience top of mind, make these safer places to exist, less addictive, but also full of more nutritious content, right? And less addled with ads as well. And then you have the kind of more top-down systemic approaches, retooling the whole system of maybe tax policies that can um, take what we've been reporting for years, that we're losing sleep, that we're anxious, that our, depression rates have skyrocketed, and make companies pay for that, literally, right? Say, hey, for every step change in these statistics, for every increase in X problem in this generation, there should be some kind of penalty, some kind of structure in place for companies to not only acknowledge that, but give back to us and like help us in a material way. And there are things that call for more agency and more democratic control over the way these things work as well. Because I think you would totally agree with this, Jose, but we as Gen Z understand better how these things should be working and have a clear idea of how we want tech to serve us and our needs as we continue to grow and enjoy our time in this world. That, someone disconnected by an age gap, by, a completely different upbringing, just can't fully appreciate. So that leads to things like interoperability, perhaps, right? We're looking into the ways in which we might be a voice on those kinds of matters as well. How can we make, tech more convivial? Um, how can we make it a place that isn't just, full of imposed features and imposed use, but something where we have the control over what's coming onto our feed. We have the control over where our data is going and how. we have the control over how often we're being notified of things in a real way, not just in little checkmark preferences like we have at the moment, but I'm talking at the level of, hey, I have this whole custom setup built out, and I can choose whether I want to see like Substack and Twitter posts on there or YouTube videos and Spotify songs, right? And I have the ability to change that at my will as well.
I so appreciate being able to have this conversation and dive into this aspect of it because it is one, it's very nice to have that peer perspective from another leader in the Gen Z space, looking at these digital issues, looking at the policy of things, um, thinking about our demographic impacts. Because it is a really unique demographic, right? I mean, for so many different reasons, from being that first digital native generation, growing up with these technologies, to where we are with cost of living, with housing, in our kind of shifting economic landscape as we talk about automation, AI, the implications across industries of that. It is so important, and I think you're underscoring this so much. It is so important for our generation to be active in these conversations because the perspective is unique, which you also noted in your remarks. The perspective is unique, and it's one that's I think really really core to looking at these policy conversations at the federal level. We get out to connect with our congressional offices, and our folks across kind of the Capitol Hill infrastructure in DC quite often, and I think there's been a really interesting growth in conversation around the needs of younger generations that are coming up. For the most part, I think folks are really receptive to at least wanting to listen to what the concerns of our organization are, of the folks that we connect with, our networks. But there are very few voices that are actually organizing around these policy issues, right? Very few. And so it's so nice to have this conversation, in part because we're identifying here another wonderful organization that is really looking at these issues critically. There's so much that we could dive into on that front too, but there are strong needs to continue to build out frameworks that are going to serve our values, our principles, our desire to be more in control of our data. And these federal frameworks are certainly a part of our agenda. And I know it's something that we're connecting on too, which is exciting.
Yeah,
I want to talk to you about a term that I'm a little unfamiliar with, so I'm going to ask you for a little bit of a kind of a description here. You're involved with the School of Radical Attention, which is a space focused on attention activism. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means, and how it complements your organizing and policy work around tech?
absolutely. So attention activism is a resistance to the negative effects of living in an attention economy, right? So the way that we think about this at the School of Attention in Brooklyn, which is a nonprofit organization that's existed for a couple years here in the city, is to help people understand that their mind has so much more capacity than it's made to feel like on a daily basis as we engage with certain technologies. So, what we do is show people that there are other forms of attention in here that can't actually be commodified, right? What's being extracted, from time spent online into profit for companies is a very specific, narrow, short spanned kind of attention, but that's not the whole story of who we are. And we lead community events and sort of various seminars and exercises to remind people of that first and foremost, to say like, hey, remember how you used to feel when you read books, did, poetry readings, played sports, whatever it is. Remember what that felt like? Here it is again. Feel inspired and go out and preserve that in your own communities, right? So we send people out with this idea that, the default doesn't have to be the brain fracked state anymore. We can reclaim these deeper experiences, these more intimate senses of connection and creativity and inspiration. And we can do that by creating sanctuaries for our attention. And that can look like many different things depending on who you are. That can be, you know, like a very personal kind of almost spiritual experience for some people. Maybe that means building up a meditation practice. Maybe that means going to a church, joining some community like that where, you know, um, social media, phone use isn't that deeply embedded. But maybe that also looks like policy work, like I've been doing with Design It For Us. Maybe that looks like teaming up with legislatures and engineers to actually understand how we can reduce this fracking at scale and also put the power back in users' hands to direct their focus, direct their lives in the direction that they want to, not get sort of pre-programmed by, habits that they didn't necessarily ask for. And for me, it is a very natural, deeply intertwined connection with my work at Design It For Us. Again, Design It For Us is a coalition of young people, mostly Gen Z, but honestly now Gen Alpha is starting to wake up to the problems and wanting to get involved as well. It's been around for a few years, and has always kind of served as this nexus for different people who are thinking about these things in different ways. But the bread and butter, that got us to where we are now before these sort of more antitrust considerations that I was bringing up a few minutes ago. What got us to this point is really, um, you know, helping shape bills and lobbying with lawmakers um, towards the preservation of our attention, right? Our attention is really the core of our experience, period. It's, the thing that gets harmed first when we talk about mental health issues, right? That's often because our attention has been compromised. And when our attention is compromised, we become so much more vulnerable to all these other things that can happen to us. If instead of being able to sit down and know exactly what I'm going to focus on and how, if instead I go down this rabbit hole on Instagram, I might get exposed to a lot of content that isn't good for me. I might, find myself in a situation that, yeah, could somehow trigger, something latent inside, some kind of like past memory, some grief, right? That isn't necessarily called for, that we don't necessarily deserve to have happen to us. So those are some of the ways that I think about this idea of attention activism. I think that anyone in this kind of responsible tech space, anyone who's looking to reform um, the ways that we are engaging with tools and what the tools themselves are, I'd consider in some way an attention activist.
I appreciate that response, and I think um, that's certainly a part of kind of our active thinking too, which I think in part is rooted in some of the examples that you all have been setting, right? And the way that you're going about connecting with folks and being more intentional about that. We've been trying to do a little bit more outreach to intentionally disconnect with folks as we're simultaneously trying to build our broader networks around some of our advocacy work in DC. and we're finding that it's just one of those things that is really well received. Um, Ironically, as we're bringing conversations around tech and the digital world to folks, to do it in a way where we're intentionally disconnecting, and letting our brains, and that genuine attention come through in the conversation. Um, I think we've all kind of experienced, and more so now in the last year, at times experienced AI fatigue as well. Um, uh, I know I have, and so really appreciate the attention uh, that we're drawing to this. I want to talk about, and no pun intended, but sure.
That'd be fun.
Yeah, I want to talk about how we are moving forward, how we're building a balanced tomorrow, particularly as Gen Z voices in this space. We're moving very rapidly towards a world where tech touches every corner of our lives. We have so many different tools on the horizon, so many different wearables, technologies, 6G, AI, iterations, quantum computing possibilities. What outcomes are we aiming for? What outcomes are you aiming for?
Yeah, I'll start with a quick example, which is really just how I've been thinking about my own set of technologies that I use regularly. So the more I leaned into this work, I realized that um, while we do have so much work to do on the systemic level, there is a lot of reframing we can do as individuals that proves extremely helpful. So I went from waiting for things to kind of change above, right? And um, sort of good ideas to finally trickle down and help me and my peers be more responsible and have better options in front of us, to realizing that a lot of options already exist and we can just take them now. So I am one of those dumb phone users that you've probably encountered. I
What's Can you like elaborate on
yeah,
is it a specific kind of phone? Is it one of like the newer phones that's
yeah,
specifically
so
designed?
I
Is it a
guess
Razer phone?
I'm kind of referring to the general movement that's, I think, also like a Gen Z particular thing, away from using a smartphone and honestly, an iPhone specifically, as your primary personal device that you carry with you all the time, to replacing that with anything that you just said, right? There are some phones that are being made today that are explicitly called dumb phones. Mine is the light phone. It's in another room right now, but it's this little e-ink display, kind of looks like a mini Kindle. And again, that idea of friction is really present in there. They have a lot of points, within the experience that slow you down, kind of cause you to take a breath and say, all right, ooh, before I send this message, like, let me make sure this is what I want to do, right? And I appreciate that. It makes me feel more deliberate with how I'm spending my time and how I'm communicating with people in my life. But there are also flip phones, right? There's the classic Nokias and Motorola's and this and that. And what I'm getting at here is just like the option to experiment with that already exists. We don't have to wait for anyone to tell us that. We don't have to wait for a law that says like everyone should have, you know, a backup phone that they use on the weekends, or everyone must have a dumb phone as their primary device and then they keep an iPhone locked away just in case they ever need it again, right? No, we can all kind of take these steps. And I think a big pillar of the future that we're headed towards is that that will be recognized, that will be normalized, not just on the, mobile device level, but in terms of like what our computer and desk setups are like, in terms of, um, yeah, the kinds of apps we're using and when we even want to use apps in the first place, right? I think we're going to get to a point where people start to realize, oh, the way that I need to keep up with my friends doesn't really require something that looks like Instagram, maybe that person will determine that they don't really need tech at all for that specific aspect of their life. But maybe they will. Maybe they think that tech is still really generative for their socialization. And what they do instead is band together with a few friends and come up with this like interesting, unique closed system, right? Like maybe it doesn't have to be a big app to begin with. Um, and there's a lot more room there for, let's say this antitrust work goes well, let's say the environment becomes a lot more competitive. Well, then, we're going to have entrepreneurs like my old 21-year-old self breaking through in a more real way, right? There's going to be room to actually succeed in that marketplace, and there will be tons of social media alternatives that appeal to different lifestyles, different use cases, and that like different types of friend groups and different, scenes are going to get onto. So that's kind of like part of my ideal, almost like utopian visions that I've been having lately. But I think it would be remiss not to talk about what we need to do on the policy level in spite of all of that hope. I alluded just now to the antitrust stuff, but that's a pretty long horizon that we're looking on relative to other things that can be done sooner and other things that groups like Design It For Us have been working on, like at present. So um, there are, I must say, some like really big barriers that need to be dealt with before we can wax poetic about, taxing people because kids are losing sleep and this and that, right? For one thing, an AI moratorium has been proposed, right? And it's still being considered at the time of our conversation right now, which is scary because that might amount to a dearth of laws for 10 years. Regulators might not be able to pass state legislation that, kind of reins in some of these massive AI products for a whole decade. And that, I think it should be pretty clear what the risks are to that. But we have been,
But
um,
that's
yeah,
kind of the interesting point,
yeah,
right? Sorry to jump in there,
oh,
but
sure.
I think that's the interesting point because you talk about that provision that made its way into the reconciliation budget package that Congress is considering right now. And when asked about it, so many of our members of Congress said, "I didn't realize that was in there.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't read that. Right? If I had known, I would have maybe voted differently." Those are the concerns, right? That we have so much at stake, particularly for our generation and generations to come, and yet we have our certain federal policymakers that are missing these things as they're creeping into some of these proposed pieces of legislation. Yeah, I
yeah,
think it was really important to kind of flag that there is a concern there.
yeah.
There is a problem that we're seeing, and I think a lot of that is related to the rate at which we're trying to address tech policy, regardless of the side,
Mhm.
and how little actually we are seeing our legislators catch and stay informed on these policies.
And I think that's precisely our job
Yeah,
as young people, as Gen Z led organizations. We have to not just keep our values in the air, but we have to scream at the top of our lungs and say, hey, this is unacceptable, right? As a major demographic that uses all of these products and as the people who are going to be running these companies in 10 years presumably, right? Like we don't stand for this, just straight up. This is not the world that we have any interest in living in.
yeah,
And I think that we need, on the one hand, to keep activating each other, activate more and more people our age to realize that it's okay to say that, to put our feet down and say, hey, wait a second, we are not okay with that, but here's what we are okay with. But we also need these Congress people to understand that on a real level. So
Yeah.
for Design It For Us's part, we've been doing a ton of phone banking. We're writing letters every single day to everyone we can, right? We are partnering with other organizations in the space to run broader messaging campaigns, just to skywrite this as boldly as possible. Um, and we're also starting to think about, how we can plan for all the different case scenarios that might shake out, right? Because regardless of this one moratorium bill, we have to be realistic and understand that um, it's a very rocky terrain and it will continue to be when it comes to AI. And it's already been that for social media, and it will always kind of be that for any emergent thing. And we are currently, revising some of our policy platforms. We just released a new AI one specifically to address all of this. And a few more will follow later this year, early next year, because we recognize that um, while we have one particular ideal world that we want to live in, we are also going to have to reckon with the fact that uh, there's give and take here, and there are like some battles that we can win quickly, other ones we're going to have to wait longer for. When it comes to the moratorium, though, you know, we're not willing to back down anytime soon on that. And I'm generally optimistic that as our generation starts to get louder, as we start to come into more positions of influence, we start to use social media not, as passive consumers, but as people with something to say, right? We use those as vehicles to get our messages out there. Um, the more we also can manage to set positive examples in our own lives, that we can do the dumb phone thing, that we can play around with all these different, setups at the software level as well, that we can even start to maybe test out apps that do exist on the App Store that don't get any clout, right? And just like see how it is, just kind of give them a chance, just see how it changes the way that our mind works. See how,
And we've seen that time and time again, right?
yeah.
As generations have come, they have built up these massive followings around style preferences, around digestion method preferences,
Yeah.
and I think that's really aspirational in addressing these concerns proactively for the generation, right?
Yep. So it's we have to hit it on all fronts. We have to be playing on all of our unique talents, and everyone has a role in this, right? Everyone has a verse to contribute, so to speak. Even if it seems a bit hazy right now, even if the road ahead in terms of like how tech will look in 5, 10, 20 years from now is very like impossible to imagine, at least
Yeah.
for me in some ways.
Yep.
I think that we just have to lean into what we believe in, and we have to keep banding together and trust that that is going to yield something really valuable.
Yeah, yeah. In the truest sense, I think it's a matter of persistence for us, and it's a matter of time, because
Mhm.
we are quite literally the generation that will inherit this landscape.
Yeah.
Um, I want to thank you, Nick. This has been like an incredible conversation, and I want to thank you so much. Um, I'm going to change things up because our
Okay.
signature last question for everybody that comes onto the podcast is always, what is your favorite current tech tool and why? But I
Mm,
want to ask you a different question, if that's
okay.
okay.
Sure.
So my closing question to you is, we have been talking a lot about disconnecting, and I want to know, what is your favorite non-digital way of disconnecting and staying grounded?
Yeah, that's a great question. My mind goes back to that idea of like an attention sanctuary that I mentioned before. And even though it kind of has that like religious language to it, it's not necessarily what it means. I I've been trying to find like the fun in unplugging lately. I started hosting a series of phone-free parties actually. I'm having one on Friday, where we just get a bunch of people in a house and we do these different activities, and also just chill and give ourselves, that space to reconnect in a way that, we don't often get to. And on the personal level, I've gotten back into poetry, which is something that I really liked growing up, really liked at the beginning of college, but it gets crowded out very easily. It's like a delicate thing to be into poetry, and there's a reason why more people aren't just walking around reciting poems anymore. I think it's like a really tough thing to do when you are super plugged in and when you are online. So I've actually been like committing some poems to memory and trying to write some of my own. I think that's been like a really restorative kind of hobby that I've built up for myself.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about these like intentionally disconnected spaces, um, and the intentionality behind that, because I do find that when I'm in a space and I'm having genuine fun with people that I love and care about, it's a lot easier to put down the phone. At least for me, when I'm genuinely in the moment, I will put down the phone and just take it in to memory. And so doing that more intentionally, I think, then also creates these more memorable occurrences for us. I want to say thank you again, Nick, for being a part of the conversation today. It's been super amazing getting to have you as a guest on our podcast. And to our listeners, sounds kind of funny to say, but who want to follow along your journey, where can they find you and your work online?
Yeah, so Designer for Us has a website. We encourage you to check out the Declaration of Digital Rights that we posted there at the beginning of this year. That's sort of like, a new Bill of Rights for our generation. And it really speaks to the things that we hope to preserve and defend in our work, on behalf of those of us who have grown up online and who have maybe not been totally respected, as, full people at all times. I think at their best, companies have acknowledged that we're individuals who want things, but at other times, it's felt a little more like we get the lab rat treatment. So check that out, and you can see more about how we're thinking about these things there. Um, Designer for Us also has a Slack that you can join through the site, and that's a place, like I said before, kind of this hub of any young person who's interested in learning more, talking more, doing real acts of service, lobbying, getting involved in all these sorts of ways. And I started a personal Substack recently as well. You can find me, I think, just under my name there, Nick Plant. And I have a bunch of more work that I'm getting ready to post soon.
Awesome. We will certainly make sure that all of these sites are linked here as we publish the podcast. Thank you again, Nick. It was an incredible conversation. Really looking forward to have this out to folks.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and can't wait to keep talking about how our organizations, can kind of band together and, yeah, just grow the scope of what we're doing.